Christina's Ghost, Chapter 8. Murder. That's what happened. We'll stop at Clearwater on the way back, Uncle Ralph said, as they walked to the car. We're running low on powdered milk and a lot of other stuff. And then I want to go to the library, if they have one, that is. Chris just stared at him, wide-eyed. Could he read her mind? Had he overheard Grandma talking? No, she decided. He was just naturally a library person. The grocery shopping went quickly, and Uncle Ralph tossing cans and packages and loaves of bread into their cart with hardly a glance at their labels. After they went next door to a drugstore, Uncle Ralph bought shaving cream, and Chris found a paperback book full of jokes and riddles. If she was going to bring sunshine into her uncle's life, maybe this book would help. And maybe not. He sniffed when he saw what she had chosen. Now the library, he said. It's right around the corner, according to the druggist. I don't suppose it's a very big one. His voice faded as they turned off the main street and stared at a tiny, one-room building marked Public Library. Uncle Ralph shook his head. Not a chance in a million that they'll have anything I need, he grumped. But I suppose they can order it for me. I'll be out in a few minutes, Christina. You just wait in the car. Chris just felt sick with disappointment. She'd pictured a big 2-story library like the one at home. How could she go into the little building and ask to see newspapers of 30 years ago in the first place? They probably wouldn't even have them. In the second place, Uncle Ralph would hear her and tell her to forget the whole thing. She walked back to the corner and looked for something to do while she waited. Across the street was a clothing store advertising a sale of summer shorts and t-shirts. Beyond that was an ice cream shop. Chocolate, pecan, and rainbow, she thought, suddenly starved. She'd take a triple-decker back for Uncle Ralph, too. She was just turning into the shop when a sign in the next window caught her eye. The Clearwater Journal. It's a newspaper office, she thought. She studied the other signs taped on the glass. Subscribe now, job printing, reasonable rates. Surely the printers would keep copies of their old newspapers, wouldn't they? The triple dippers forgotten, Chris marched into the office and looked around. A skinny, glum-looking man was behind the counter. One fist was clutched at a phone, and the other was jotting additions to a long list of items. He had an odd, glazed expression, and his face flicked over Chris without seeing her. After what seemed a very long time, he mumbled a goodbye and hung up. Liberated woman, he snarled into the air above Chris's head. Excuse me? She took one step closer to the counter. Women, the man snapped. Wives. Chris looked over her shoulder, ready to run if necessary. I suppose when you grow up, you're going to want a career, the man jeered. He made career sound like it was terrible. My wife's a nurse. Works second shift at the hospital. Chris cleared her throat. That's nice, she said cautiously. There's nothing nice about it. She calls to tell me what to do and the list of the groceries. She calls to tell me to wash the windows. She calls to tell me what to fix for dinner. He shook his head so hard that the pencil that was poised behind one ear just flew through the air. And what do you want? I want to see some old newspapers, Chris said. The request sounded silly even to herself. How old? The man glared at the phone as if he was daring it to ring. About 30 years, Chris said. If it isn't too much trouble. Oh, it's trouble, the man said. What week do you want? We publish once a week. I don't know. Why had she thought this would work? The man scooped up his pencil and thrust it back behind his ear. Then I can't help you, he said, sounding pleased. You certainly don't expect me to pull a whole year's worth of newspapers, do you? Well, that was exactly what Chris had hoped to do, but she didn't dare say so. Clearly he didn't like females, even very young ones. Maybe he didn't like anybody. She shifted from one foot and then to the other. We're staying at the old Charles house, she said. It's a big house on the lake, way out in the woods. My uncle says something happened there about 30 years ago. I want to find out what it was. The man scowled. No need to get out a pack of newspapers to tell you that, he muttered. Murders. That's what happened at the Charles house. Murders? 2 people. A man and a boy. The man pursed his lips. It's not a nice story, and you shouldn't even want to know about it. You should be learning to cook or making dolls' clothes. He narrowed his eyes at her. Nobody does what they're supposed to anymore. Nobody. He turned away and hunched over the list on his desk. Chris waited. When he looked to see if she was still there, she forced a smile. Just 1 paper, then? She pleaded. Or 2? That wouldn't be too much trouble, would it? The man came back to the counter and glared down at her. Do you want to know something? He demanded. You remind me of my wife. You women. He turned away so fast that the pencil again took off and arched over the counter. 1 paper, he said, and that's all. That's fine, Chris said quickly. Thanks a lot. Now, if you'll just hurry up, she thought, so she could read it before Uncle Ralph comes looking for me. The man didn't hurry, but when he returned from the back room, Chris saw that he'd chosen the single newspaper with care. Charles Murders Solved, the headline said in big letters. Under it were several stories concerning the case. Chris thanked him again and carried the paper to the window. She wanted to keep a lookout for Uncle Ralph while she read. The first article was a background piece on the Charles family. They were a wealthy Milwaukee family who had built a house on the lakeshore and lived there quietly for several years before their only child, Russell, was born. A grainy snapshot of Russell showed him wearing a rain slicker and a helmet. Early one spring, Mr. and Mrs. Charles went to Europe on an extended business trip. They hired a tutor companion named Thomas Dixon to stay with the boy while they were away. 6 weeks later, Dixon and Russell were found shot to death in the big house. The Charleses were brokenhearted. After their return from Europe, they stayed in the house only a couple of weeks. Then they closed it up and moved away from the painful memories that it held. A second article consisted of an interview with the sheriff after the capture of one of the murderers. The killer had confessed at once, admitting that he and Dixon and 2 other men were involved in a theft of some extremely valuable stamps in New York. Dixon had run away, taking the rarest stamps with him and leaving his partners with little to show for their crime. He'd taken the position with the Charles family in order to hide out for a while. When the furious thieves caught up with him, he'd refused to tell them where he'd hidden the stamps. They had killed him. Then they killed the little boy as well because he'd seen and heard too much. Chris read as fast as she could. According to the sheriff, the stamps still had not been found, and he thought they were gone for good. Dixon might have sold them on his way to the Midwest. He might even have lost them or destroyed them. She glanced up. Uncle Ralph was just coming around the corner. He looked both ways, then turned and started up the street in the other direction. She hurried back to the counter, scooping up the man's pencil on the way. Here's the paper, she said. Thanks again. The man was at his desk, glaring at his list as if it might bite him. When he looked up, his expression was mournful. I bet you never played with a doll in your life, he said. Nobody does what they're supposed to do anymore. Chris rolled the pencil across the counter and darted to the door. Goodbye, she called over her shoulder and ran outside before he could accuse her of anything else. Halfway up the next block and on the other side of the street, Uncle Ralph was peering into windows. His shoulders were hunched with annoyance, and he hunted for her. And Chris knew he would agree with the man in the newspaper office that nobody does what they're supposed to anymore. She hurried next door and ordered 2 ice cream cones, hopping from one foot to the other while she waited for the clerk to ring up the sale. I told you to wait in the car, Uncle Ralph said when Chris caught up to him at last, but he cut the scolding short when she handed him a triple-decker cone. A triple-decker's with 3 ice cream scoops. Meekly, she followed him to the car. Her head was whirling with all that she'd learned in the last few minutes. Russell Charles. That, she thought, that's his name. And he really is. He truly is a ghost. She even knew when he had died, and she could make a guess about the terrifying presence in the attic. That was Thomas Dixon up there, she thought. The ghost of a man who stole the stamps and then cheated his partners. The ghost of the man who was responsible for Russell Charles having been murdered. Dun dun dun.